So today, we're diving into the story of Epaphroditus. Now, he's someone you might only know from a handful of verses in Paul's letter to the Philippians.
That's right.
Not exactly a household name like Peter or Paul himself.
No, definitely not. But the way Paul talks about him, even in those few lines, it paints a picture of someone, well, pretty remarkable.
He appears in Philippians 2, verses 25 to 30, and then there's a quick mention in chapter 4, verse 18.
Exactly. And what jumps out immediately is just how highly Paul praises him. I mean, listen to this. My brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier.
Wow, strong words.
And he doesn't stop there. He also calls him the Philippian church's messenger and minister to my need.
Brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier. That's quite an introduction, isn't it?
It really is. Sets a high bar.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really explore the life and service of this, let's say, lesser-known individual. We want to pull out all the insights we can from those verses.
Try and piece together who he was.
Yeah, who was he? What kind of challenges did he face? And, what does his brief but clearly powerful story tell us about things like dedication and service?
It really is a snapshot, isn't it? A snapshot of a life totally committed. Committed even to the point of risking absolutely everything for what Paul calls the work of Christ.
And the context is key here, right? Paul's under house arrest.
Right, probably in Rome. That's the general consensus. And the church back in Philippi, they've sent Epaphroditus to him.
Sent him with a gift, and also to help Paul out personally.
Exactly, bearing support and offering that hands-on ministry.
Okay, so let's start trying to figure out the man himself. Based on the little we're given, what can we actually gather about his identity? Where did he come from?
Well, the first clue is obviously his name, Epaphroditus.
Epaphroditus.
It's a Greek name.
Yeah.
Actually, it was incredibly common back then in the ancient world.
And there's a really fascinating inference people draw from that name, isn't there?
Absolutely. The name Epaphroditus, it's generally understood to mean something like belonging to Aphrodite.
Aphrodite, the Greek goddess.
Yeah, the goddess of love and beauty. The name stems directly from her.
Belonging to Aphrodite? I mean, that doesn't exactly scream early Christian church leader, does it?
Oh.
Especially someone so close to Paul.
Precisely. That's the point. The strong inference, because it was such a common pagan name, is that Epaphroditus very likely came from a pagan background. A family life, a home life, probably steeped in the worship of Greek gods like Aphrodite.
So he probably wasn't raised Jewish or in one of the very first Christian families.
That seems highly unlikely given the name, which means his becoming a follower of Jesus. Well, that would have represented a really dramatic transformation.
A huge shift, going from a world maybe filled with idols and many gods to, exclusive devotion to Christ.
That's the really significant implication here. His conversion wouldn't have been just a minor adjustment. It was likely a radical break from his past, a total reorientation of his identity, his loyalty, everything.
That really highlights the power of the gospel message back then.
It does. It shows that anyone, I mean literally anyone, no matter their background or what they believed before, could be fundamentally changed and become this incredibly dedicated servant of Christ. His new identity in Jesus just completely took over his old one.
That adds a layer of kind of wonder to his story right from the get-go. This wasn't just carrying on a family tradition for him.
No, it seems it was revolutionary, a complete change.
It reminds us of that transformative power faith can have.
It certainly does. And it's also interesting, Paul calls guys like Timothy and Titus his sons in the faith.
Right.
But he calls Epaphroditus his brother.
What might that slight difference in language suggest?
Well, it could possibly suggest that Paul wasn't the person who first shared the gospel with Epaphroditus. Maybe someone else led him to faith.
Oh,
They're clearly brothers in Christ, part of the same spiritual family, and they definitely became co-workers, partners in ministry. But maybe their paths to faith started separately before they connected. It's a possibility.
So we don't have the specifics of his upbringing or exactly how he heard the gospel message.
No, those details are lost to us.
But his name itself gives us this powerful hint about the profound change that must have happened. A move from potentially belonging to Aphrodite to belonging completely to Jesus.
Exactly. The explicit biographical details, the life story stuff, it's just not there in the text. But that name, it speaks volumes about the world he likely came out of.
Okay, so this man, Epaphroditus, with this potentially surprising background, he gets sent by the Philippian church to Paul. What exactly was his mission?
His main task, number one, was to travel all the way from Philippi, that's in Macedonia, modern-day Greece, to Rome. where Paul was under house arrest,
And the purpose.
to deliver a gift from the church.
And this wasn't just like a small token gift, was it?
No, it seems it was pretty significant. Paul describes it later as an acceptable sacrifice pleasing to God.
High praise for a gift.
It is. We generally understand this to be material support, most likely financial aid for Paul. And it's noted that the church entrusted Epaphroditus with what seems like a substantial sum of money.
Just the fact they trusted him with that says a lot, doesn't it?
It really does. It tells you about his reputation, his character. They clearly had complete confidence in him. One interpretation phrases it nicely. They knew this large sum was never going to be a problematic temptation for someone whose identity was cemented as a servant of all.
Wow. That really speaks to his integrity. They knew he wouldn't be swayed by it because his focus was on serving.
It highlights his trustworthiness, his proven character, definitely. But his role wasn't just being a courier, dropping off the money.
Right, Paul calls him his minister, too.
Yes, specifically minister to my need. And the Greek word Paul uses there, leitokorgos, is actually quite interesting.
Leitenturgos. Okay, what does that imply?
Well, it carries the sense of being a public servant or someone performing a specific service, sometimes even a liturgical or official one. In the wider Greek world, it could even refer to a wealthy citizen who took on public duties or funded public projects at their own expense.
Huh. So that word might suggest Epaphroditus wasn't just a volunteer helper. Maybe he was an official representative, or perhaps even someone with some status or means in the Philippian church.
That's an interpretation some scholars draw from that specific term, yeah. He could have been someone with the resources or maybe the position to not only deliver the church's financial gift, but also to stay on and personally look after Paul's needs.
Doing what the church back in Philippi couldn't do because they were so far away.
Exactly. He was, in a sense, an extension of their love and care. He was providing the practical, hands-on service that Paul needed while he was confined.
So it wasn't just drop off the package and leave. He was staying to be the ministry, to physically serve Paul there.
Precisely. It was a real labor of love. He devoted himself to supporting Paul, which Paul clearly saw as the work of Christ. This meant providing practical support, maybe companionship, just helping Paul in his daily life under house arrest.
What might that have involved day to day?
Oh, it could have been anything. Running errands, helping him write letters or communicate, making sure Paul had food and basic necessities. Some have even suggested things like basic nursing care if Paul was unwell, or maybe just, trying to make his confinement a bit more bearable, easing his chain, chafing his aching wrists, as one writer evocatively put it.
Simple, humble, but absolutely essential service.
Yes, it was humble, necessary service. And it really underscores that the work of Christ isn't just preaching or teaching. It absolutely includes these practical, everyday acts of service and support.
That's a great point. It wasn't just the spiritual stuff.
Exactly. He stepped into the gap created by Paul's imprisonment and the physical distance of the Philippians. And in taking on this mission, he faced some pretty significant challenges.
Okay, let's talk about those challenges. What made this journey and this service so difficult for him?
Well, first off, just the journey itself. Traveling from Philippi up in what's now northern Greece all the way down to Rome, that was a major, major undertaking in the first century.
We're talking serious distance.
Huge distance, over 700 miles. One calculation based on the likely routes puts it at maybe 729 miles.
Wow. And 700 miles back then. I mean, that's a completely different world than hopping on a plane today.
Oh, absolutely. Night and day. The probable route would have involved walking a long stretch of the Via Egnatia, the big Roman road across Greece.
Right.
Then he'd have to cross the Adriatic Sea by ship, and ancient sea travel was always risky, unpredictable, weather, pirates, you name it.
Not exactly a luxury cruise.
Not at all. And then, after landing in Italy, more walking, probably along the famous Via Appia, the Appian Way leading into Rome.
Okay, so a multi-stage journey. How long would a trip like that typically take?
Well, estimates suggest the walking parts alone could take around 57 days.
57 days.
Yeah, so you're looking at nearly 2 months of travel time, one way. Just think about that being away from your home, your family, your work, your church community for that long.
That's incredible.
Navigating potentially difficult terrain, uncertain weather, relying on basic roadside inns or hospitality. It's a massive commitment.
That's a huge investment of time and personal sacrifice just to get to Paul.
It really is. And we haven't even mentioned the inherent dangers of travel back then.
Right.
Paul doesn't give us specifics about Epaphroditus' journey.
Wow.
No dramatic stories of escaping bandits or surviving a shipwreck like Paul himself experienced.
Sure.
But just the general conditions of ancient travel included constant risks. Things like getting sick from bad food or contaminated water, sheer exhaustion from walking day after day, the general lack of security on the roads, just the basic hardships of that kind of long journey would take a serious physical toll.
So just arriving in Rome was a major accomplishment in itself.
Definitely. So getting there was tough. Then he arrives, and he starts serving Paul, who's under house arrest. Did that service itself carry risks?
Good question. Was it dangerous just being associated with Paul?
It certainly could have been.
Yeah.
Paul was confined, possibly near the main camp of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite soldiers.
Okay.
Anyone closely connected with him, especially someone actively ministering to his needs day in and day out, could easily have come under suspicion from the Roman authorities. Remember why Paul was arrested.
Right. His message was seen as disruptive, a challenge to Roman authority and religion.
Exactly. It wasn't like he was in for a minor tax issue. His imprisonment was directly linked to his evangelism, which was viewed by some as politically subversive or religiously troublesome. So helping Paul, being his close associate, was in a way siding with that perceived challenge.
You're putting yourself in the spotlight, potentially.
You are. In Paul's own terms, this was spiritual warfare. It was a battle against the forces opposing the gospel. And Epaphroditus, by serving Paul in that situation, effectively became his comrade in arms, his fellow soldier, right there on the front lines with him in Rome.
Wow. That phrase, fellow soldier, takes on more weight then.
It does. That physical closeness to Paul and his situation meant sharing the risk.
So a grueling journey, potentially dangerous service. And then the biggest challenge Paul mentions, his illness.
Yes, this is absolutely central to Paul's account of him in Philippians 2. Paul states very clearly that Epaphroditus became severely ill. So sick, Paul says, even to the point of death.
To the point of death?
Some translations render it, he came nigh unto death. He was right on the edge.
That sounds absolutely terrifying. Does Paul give any hints about what caused this life-threatening sickness?
No, the sources, meaning Paul's letter here, don't specify the exact cause or the nature of the illness. It's silent on the diagnosis, if you like.
So we're left to speculate based on the context.
Pretty much. Various possibilities have been suggested over the centuries. Maybe it was sheer overexertion from that incredibly difficult journey, followed by demanding service.
Plausible?
Maybe it was the climate in Rome itself. Some ancient writers described Rome's air, especially in summer, as enervating or unhealthy.
Interesting.
Or perhaps exposure to an unhealthy environment connected to Paul's confinement. We don't know the exact conditions, but maybe it wasn't ideal.
Right.
Or it could have been something contracted during the journey, tainted food, bad water, something infectious he picked up along the way.
Any of those really underscore the physical price he paid for this mission?
They do. But what's absolutely crucial is how Paul frames the reason for his illness. Paul doesn't say it was because Epaphroditus did something wrong or lacked faith or anything like that.
What does he say?
He says specifically that the illness was for the work of Christ.
For the work of Christ.
Yeah.
That's a really powerful connection, especially given he almost died.
It is, and it gives us a very important theological angle here. Paul's statement directly challenges any idea that, deep faith or really dedicated service automatically guarantees you good health and safety.
So it pushes back against ideas, maybe like some forms of prosperity theology, that suggest sickness is always a sign you've done something wrong or your faith isn't strong enough.
Exactly that. Here you have Epaphroditus, a deeply devoted believer, highly commended by Paul himself, performing absolutely vital service, and he gets deathly ill precisely because of that service for the work of Christ.
So his story is a clear biblical counterexample to that line of thinking.
It absolutely is. It demonstrates that spiritual devotion and doing God's work can sometimes actually increase your exposure to hardship, to danger, to illness, even potentially lead to death.
That's a really significant point. His suffering wasn't a sign of God's anger or his own failure. It was, in a sense, a consequence of his faithfulness.
Yes. And the severity was undeniable. Paul says he almost died. He was on the very brink, and it seems the illness wasn't just a quick thing either.
How do we know that?
Well, think about communication back then. News traveled incredibly slowly. For news of his serious sickness to travel all the way from Rome back to Philippi.
That would take weeks, maybe months.
Right. And then for the Philippians to hear it, get distressed, and then for news of their distress to travel back to Rome and reach Epaphroditus.
Wow. Yeah, that implies a significant amount of time passed.
It does. It strongly suggests he was seriously ill for a considerable period. This wasn't just a 24-hour bug that laid him low for a day or two. This was prolonged and severe.
Okay, so let's recap the challenges. A long, dangerous journey, service in a potentially risky environment in Rome, and then a severe, prolonged, life-threatening illness that was directly linked to his dedicated service. That really paints a picture of the sacrifice involved.
It gives us a very clear picture of the cost of his commitment. And these challenges, they tie right back into that profound transformation we talked about earlier, which leads us into some really pivotal moments in his story that Paul shares.
All right, let's explore those pivotal moments and loop back to that transformation. We mentioned the inference that he came from a pagan background linked to that name, belonging to Aphrodite. How does knowing that or suspecting that help us understand his actions here?
Well, it just adds context to how radical his faith must have been. This likely wasn't someone who grew up in a culture or religious tradition where selfless service and exclusive devotion to one God were the norm.
True. Paganism was very different.
Very different. So his transformation from potentially worshiping idols, participating in pagan festivals, to becoming a follower of Jesus, willing to literally risk his life for another believer, it just highlights the complete 180-degree shift in his worldview, his values, his entire life that faith brought about.
So his actions making that tough journey, selflessly serving Paul, pushing through that near-fatal illness because it was for Christ's work,
Yeah.
these aren't things you'd expect from someone whose ultimate loyalty might have once been to a goddess like Aphrodite.
Not at all.
They become powerful evidence of a life just profoundly changed by faith in Jesus.
They really are. It underscores that his dedication wasn't just surface level. It came from a deep, life-altering commitment to Christ. And Paul's letter, it captures several key moments, these snapshots, that really define Epaphroditus' story for us.
Okay, what were those key events that Paul chooses to highlight?
Well, the first one is his arrival in Rome. He made it. He completed that incredibly arduous journey. He delivered the gift from the Philippian church. And he began his personal ministry attending to Paul's needs.
So, mission accomplished, phase 1.
Exactly. The fulfillment of the first part of his mission and the start of his service there alongside Paul.
Okay, mission underway. What's the next pivotal moment Paul mentions?
Then comes the severe illness. He became sick, even to the point of death, as Paul tells it. And Paul specifically notes, remember, that this happened for the work of Christ. This near-death experience is a crucial turning point in the whole narrative.
And word of this critical illness somehow makes it all the way back to Philippi.
Yes, that's the next key moment. News gets back home. The Philippian church hears that their representative, their friend, is critically ill in Rome. And Paul says it caused them great distress, great sorrow.
Which tells you something about the church too, right? Their connection.
Absolutely. It highlights the close bonds, the genuine care within that community. They didn't just send him off and forget about him. They were deeply invested in his well-being, anxiously waiting for news.
And then comes the detail that, for me, reveals so much about Epaphroditus himself, his character.
Ah, yes. This is perhaps the most moving, the most telling moment of all. Paul says that when Epaphroditus eventually heard that the Philippians were distressed about his sickness, he himself became deeply distressed.
Wait, so he recovers slightly, hears that people back home are worried about him, and that makes him distressed, not his own suffering.
Exactly. It's extraordinary selflessness, isn't it? He wasn't primarily consumed by his own pain or the fact that he nearly died. His main concern, once he heard from home, was the anxiety and the sorrow that his illness was causing the people who sent him and cared about him.
Wow. He was worried because they were worried about him.
It's a remarkable display of empathy, putting others' feelings, their worries, completely before your own situation. As one commentator puts it so well, Epaphroditus was worried lest the Philippians worry about him.
That captures it perfectly. It paints this picture of, like, mutual care where nobody is primarily focused on themselves.
Precisely. It's a beautiful, living illustration of the kind of interconnected love and concern that Paul was always encouraging in the churches. Another perspective described it this way. Everyone was concerned for someone else. Epaphroditus is concerned for the Philippians. The Philippians are concerned for Epaphroditus. Paul is concerned for both of them. Nobody is concerned about themselves.
That little anecdote just encapsulates that whole spirit of selfless community.
It really does. It shows the kind of community Paul envisioned and that clearly existed, at least to a strong degree, between him, Epaphroditus, and the Philippians.
That moment really defines his character for us, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
So what was the final pivotal moment in the story, as Paul recounts it.
It's Paul's decision, once Epaphroditus had recovered sufficiently, to send him back home to Philippi. And Paul is very careful to explain why he's sending him back.
Right, it wasn't like, okay, you're better now, thanks for your help, off you go.
Not at all. Paul makes it clear this wasn't because Epaphroditus was no longer needed or that he'd become a burden after being sick. Quite the opposite, actually. Paul sent him back out of deep pastoral care and concern. Concern for both Epaphroditus and the Philippian church.
So, what was the goal of sending him back?
It seems twofold. First, Paul knew the Philippians would be overjoyed to see Epaphroditus alive and well again, and it would relieve their intense anxiety about him. Second, Paul says that seeing them rejoice would also make Paul himself feel less anxious. He cared about their emotional state, too.
So his return journey was actually an act of love and pastoral care, aimed at bringing comfort and joy and relief to the entire community network, Epaphroditus, the Philippians, and Paul himself.
Exactly. It wasn't a dismissal of his valuable service at all. It was a recognition of the strong mutual bonds of affection and the very real human need for both Epaphroditus and the Philippians to be reunited and reassured after such a frightening episode.
Okay, so these moments, his arrival, the near-fatal illness, that powerful display of mutual concern, and then his timely, caring return, they really form the core narrative of what we know about Epaphroditus' life and ministry from Paul.
They do, and they directly underscore why Paul felt he was worthy of such exceptional honor.
Which brings us nicely to understanding that honor, because Paul doesn't just send him back, does he? He sends him with this, glowing letter of recommendation.
He really does, a powerful endorsement, and he includes a specific instruction for the Philippian church about how to receive him.
He starts by repeating those significant titles again.
He does. He circles back, calling him my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier. And these aren't just, fancy labels. They convey deep relationship and a shared sense of purpose.
Let's break those down again quickly.
Okay.
What do they signify here?
Okay, brother. It's fundamental, but crucial. It emphasizes their shared spiritual family, their deep unity in Christ. It's the bedrock of their relationship.
Simple, but essential for a Christian community, yeah.
Then, fellow worker. This really highlights that following Christ isn't passive. It involves labor, active service, real effort. Epaphroditus didn't just have faith, he worked alongside Paul, actively participating in advancing the gospel.
And that title reminds us that serving in those practical, supportive ways, even the stuff that seems mundane, Paul considered that the work of Christ.
Absolutely. It wasn't just Paul doing the important work of preaching. Epaphroditus ensuring Paul was cared for, enabling Paul's ministry. That was equally vital work in Paul's eyes. It elevates the importance of those often unseen behind-the-scenes roles.
So the practical tasks, the logistics, the personal support, all part of the work. Got it.
Definitely. And then there's fellow soldier. This title, Sistratiches in Greek, speaks directly to the reality that Christian life involves spiritual conflict, a battle against opposition, sometimes outright persecution.
Which Paul was experiencing firsthand, being imprisoned.
Exactly. Paul was locked up because of the gospel message. And Epaphroditus, by choosing to be there with him, supporting him, standing by him through thick and thin, he was actively participating in that spiritual struggle.
Yeah.
He was Paul's loyal comrade, his ally in the fight.
There was that interesting point about how fellow soldier might have had extra resonance for the people in Philippi specifically.
Yes, some interpreters point out that Philippi was a Roman colony, founded originally for retired Roman soldiers. It had a strong military heritage and likely still a significant military presence, maybe even including members of the Praetorian Guard, whom Paul actually mentions by name later in this same letter.
Wow.
So the term fellow soldier would have been instantly familiar, very concrete, and meaningful to many people in that Philippian church. It could have helped them grasp the seriousness and the nature of the spiritual struggle they were all engaged in, alongside Paul and Epaphroditus.
That's a compelling thought about Paul tailoring his language.
It's presented as a possible inference, yeah, but it makes sense. Whether they caught a direct military connection or just the metaphor, fellow soldier clearly communicates deep loyalty, shared risk, and commitment in a common, difficult cause.
Definitely. So after describing Epaphroditus with these really weighty titles, Paul gives the Philippians that clear instruction. What was it?
He tells them, "Receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men."
Receive him with joy makes sense after their worry. But then, honor such men. Why does Paul feel so strongly that Epaphroditus deserves this specific, deliberate honor?
Paul gives the reason explicitly in the very next verse, verse 30, because for the work of Christ he came nigh unto death, hazarding his life.
There it is again. He risked his life.
That's the absolute core reason for the honor. Or, as other translations put it, risking his life, or not regarding his life, or disregarding his own life.
You put the mission above his own survival. What more can we unpack from that phrase, risking his life?
Well, the Greek phrase Paul uses here, parabolusamenos tas psyche, is quite vivid. And one really intriguing interpretation suggests Paul might even be making a clever, subtle play on Epaphroditus' name itself.
How so? Relating back to Aphrodite.
Possibly. The verb Paul uses can be related to a word used in gambling parabolustai, meaning to risk everything, to gamble recklessly like throwing the dice. And remember, Epaphroditus' name means something like favored by Aphrodite, perhaps implying good luck or fortune.
Ah, so a potential pun, connecting a gambling term to his formerly pagan name association.
That's the idea some scholars propose. The thought is that Epaphroditus, instead of relying on pagan luck or invoking Aphrodite for favor, instead truly risked his life, like gambling everything he had, but he did it for the sake of Christ and his work. He hazarded his life, Paul says, to complete what was lacking in your service toward me.
Okay, we need to clarify that phrase, what was lacking, because it could easily sound like Paul is criticizing the Philippians, like they didn't do enough.
Yes, that's a crucial clarification. That phrase definitely needs careful handling. It almost certainly does not imply any failure or negligence or stinginess on the part of the Philippian church. Paul repeatedly praises their consistent generosity and support for him.
So what was lacking then?
Simply their physical presence. Because they were in Philippi and he was imprisoned in Rome, they couldn't personally be there to provide the day-to-day, hands-on care and ministry Paul needed. That's what was lacking, their physical proximity.
Oh, okay. So Epaphroditus filled that gap.
Exactly. He was their representative, their sent one, apostolos, messenger. He completed their service by being there in person, doing the things they wished they could do but couldn't because of the distance. He was embodying and fulfilling their loving desire and intention to serve Paul personally.
So he stepped into that physical void, embodying their care. And in doing that, he faced death.
Precisely. And Paul presents Epaphroditus' near-fatal illness not as some unfortunate accident or sign of weakness, but as a direct consequence, almost like evidence, of his dedicated, costly service for the work of Christ. That is the heart of his quiet heroism.
Quiet heroism, I like that.
Serving faithfully, often in practical, maybe unnoticed ways, even when it meant facing severe illness, staring death in the face. That, Paul says, is what is truly worthy of honor in the church.
It really reframes what true honor looks like in God's economy, doesn't it? It's not about the spotlight or the titles nearly as much as costly faithfulness.
It absolutely does. It tells us that some of the most valuable, most honored service for Christ might be the least visible, the kind that involves deep personal sacrifice, vulnerability, and risk, all undertaken for the sake of others and the advancement of the gospel.
Okay, this is fascinating. We've traced his story, his name, background, mission, the intense challenges, those pivotal moments Paul highlights, and why Paul held him in such high honor. Let's shift now into the lessons and the ongoing legacy of Epaphroditus. One point that this story brings up is that theological question surrounding his healing, or lack thereof initially.
Yes, this is an interesting point that often comes up in discussions about this passage. Here you have Epaphroditus, deathly ill, and you have Paul, who we know from the book of Acts, God sometimes used to perform miraculous healings. Remember, on the island of Malta, Acts 28, people were brought to him and healed.
Right.
Yet, Paul apparently didn't just instantly heal his close friend and fellow worker Epaphroditus. He writes about God showing mercy, implying a process of recovery rather than an instant miracle cure commanded by Paul.
Why is that considered significant?
Well, it often gets pulled into debates about the nature of spiritual gifts, particularly healing gifts, in the New Testament era and beyond. Some might look at this and argue, see, miraculous healing gifts were already temporary. They were fading away even during Paul's lifetime.
Okay, that's one perspective.
However, another perspective, which seems well supported by the context in other scriptures, offers a different interpretation.
And what's that view?
It suggests that this situation doesn't necessarily mean healing gifts were disappearing. Instead, it highlights perhaps their occasional nature, meaning they weren't automatic powers that the gifted person could wield at will in every situation.
Ah, so it's more dependent on God's timing and will.
Exactly. Dependent on God's sovereign will and purpose in that specific instance, not just on human command or desire. Even someone genuinely gifted by God for healing might not be able to heal everyone they pray for, or even the same person every single time they get sick. God's specific purpose in allowing or healing sickness remains paramount.
So it wasn't necessarily a failure of Paul's faith or lack in his spiritual gift. It might simply have been an instance where God, in his own wisdom and sovereignty, allowed the illness to run its course, even for this incredibly faithful servant, before ultimately granting recovery.
That's the interpretation many arrive at. And it seems to fit with other examples in the New Testament where devoted, godly believers also experienced ongoing or serious illness.
Like who?
Well, Paul advises Timothy, his close companion, to take a little wine for his frequent stomach problems, implying an ongoing issue, not instant healing. And Paul himself mentions in another letter having to leave Trophimus, another fellow worker, behind in the city of Miletus because he was sick.
Right. So sickness happened even to key people in the early church.
It did. These examples reinforce the idea that illness is simply a reality of life in this fallen world, even for very godly individuals. It isn't automatically or always a direct result of personal sin or a lack of faith.
It definitely adds complexity to that question of why some people receive miraculous healing and others don't, a mystery many people still wrestle with today.
It absolutely does. But it's important to note, even with that mystery, the narrative here certainly doesn't discourage prayer for healing. Paul expresses profound gratitude and relief that God did eventually show mercy by healing Epaphroditus. He says God spared him, and Paul himself, from having sorrow upon sorrow.
So he was clearly praying and thankful for the recovery.
Immensely thankful. So, while the story acknowledges God's sovereignty and the mystery involved, it doesn't negate the reality or the possibility of God intervening with healing, often in response to prayer.
Okay, so despite the challenges, despite the theological questions around his illness, Epaphroditus' life clearly left an enduring legacy. How does his story, his life, ultimately glorify God?
I think his life glorifies God primarily through the powerful example he set. His selfless service, putting Paul's needs and the Philippians' feelings above his own. His unwavering loyalty, sticking with Paul through imprisonment and risk. His courage in facing danger and that near-fatal illness. His embodiment of the Philippian church's generous, caring spirit. All these qualities, they point back to the transforming power of God working in his life.
Right, his actions weren't just admirable in a human sense. They directly advanced what Paul calls the work of Christ, both by physically enabling Paul's ministry through practical care, and maybe just as importantly, by serving as this living, breathing example of what true dedication and Christ-like sacrifice look like.
Exactly. And the very fact that his story is preserved here in Scripture, immortalized through Paul's obviously heartfelt words of commendation, ensures that these qualities continue to inspire and instruct believers centuries later. We only know about this quiet hero because Paul chose to lift him up and highlight his incredibly worthy service.
So, if we were to distill all of this down, what are the key lessons for us today? What can you and I, and anyone listening, learn from this man, Epaphroditus, based on these few verses?
I think several really important lessons emerge quite clearly. First, there's the unavoidable lesson of sacrificial service. Epaphroditus prioritized serving Paul and the needs of the gospel mission way above his own comfort, his own safety, even his own health. He embraced costly service, not just convenient service.
That's a huge challenge for us, isn't it? To consider what service costs us.
It really is. It challenges us to think about our own willingness to step outside our comfort zones, maybe risk something for the sake of others or the gospel.
Okay, sacrificial service. What else?
Second, he teaches us so much about the importance of truly valuing and caring for fellow believers. Remember his deep distress over the Philippians' worry, more than his own suffering. That's just such a powerful illustration of the kind of empathetic, mutual care that should ideally define Christian community.
Like really feeling with others.
Exactly. It's a call to genuinely look out for the emotional and spiritual well-being of others in our churches and communities with real concern, not just going through the motions.
A beautiful example of bearing one another's burdens. Makes sense. What's third?
Third, his story is a model of perseverance through hardship. He faced that incredibly difficult journey, potential danger in Rome, and then that severe, life-threatening illness. And Paul explicitly links it all to the work of Christ.
Right.
His experience reminds us that faithfully following Jesus doesn't guarantee an easy, trouble-free path. Sometimes it actually calls us to endure significant difficulties for his sake and for the sake of the gospel, trusting that even suffering, when endured for the right reasons, can be purposeful in God's plan.
And as we discussed, that hardship isn't necessarily a sign of spiritual failure or God's displeasure.
Absolutely not. Fourth, there's the powerful lesson of quiet heroism. Epaphroditus' service, as far as we can tell, was largely practical behind the scenes, probably unnoticed by the wider world, maybe even by many in the church back home, yet Paul considered him worthy of the highest honor.
It's so important.
It reminds us that the most valuable contributions to God's work aren't always the ones that get the most attention, the upfront roles, the public speaking. Faithfulness in practical, often unseen ministry is deeply, deeply significant and truly valued by God.
That's incredibly encouraging for anyone who feels like their service is maybe small or hidden.
It really should be. And finally, there's that lesson about dedication despite background. His inferred journey from a pagan world, from belonging to Aphrodite to this profound devotion to Christ, it just underscores that anyone, absolutely anyone, no matter their past, their upbringing, where they come from, their family history, anyone can be radically transformed by Christ and become a fully dedicated, highly effective servant in his work. The past doesn't limit God's ability to use a willing and surrendered heart.
Wow. Sacrificial service, mutual care, perseverance through hardship, quiet heroism, and dedication from any background. Those are some incredibly powerful lessons to draw from just a handful of verses about one man.
They really are, aren't they? Epaphroditus, though he only gets this brief mention, stands as such a compelling example of a life lived in full-throttle devotion to Christ and his people.
So we've taken a pretty deep dive, I think, into the life of Epaphroditus. We've explored those hints about his identity, the really significant challenges he had to navigate, the profound transformation his faith seems to have brought about, those pivotal moments Paul chooses to highlight for us, why he was held in such high regard, and the practical, relevant lessons his story still offers us today.
Yeah, he's presented to us so clearly as a devoted brother in faith, a tireless fellow worker in the gospel trenches, and a genuinely courageous fellow soldier who willingly, consciously risked his life, faced down severe illness, and exemplified that kind of selfless service and deep mutual care that was and should be characteristic of the church community.
His brief story really challenges our assumptions, I think, about who is important in ministry or in God's work. It highlights the immense value of faithful, costly service in all its many forms, maybe especially the quiet forms.
And what's truly fascinating, isn't it, is how Paul chooses to define what makes someone worthy of honor. He focuses not on eloquence or status or leadership position, but on these concrete actions: loyalty, self-sacrifice, practical ministry, commitment, even when facing death itself.
Yeah. Thinking about Epaphroditus, this man who Paul says should be honored,
Yeah.
not for having grand titles, not for being famous across the Roman Empire, but simply for risking his life in practical service for the work of Christ.
It brings up a really important question, I think, for you, for everyone listening to consider personally. What does that kind of quiet, sacrificial dedication actually look like in your own life right now, today?
That's a searching question. How might you be called to risk something? Maybe it's your time, maybe your comfort zone, perhaps your reputation in some circles, maybe even in some situations your physical well-being. How might you be called to risk something to serve others or advance the work of Christ in ways that might go totally unnoticed by most people, but are deeply valued by God and by your fellow believers who understand?
Yeah, it's worth pondering. Consider the example of Epaphroditus, who just seems to have focused on finishing the task he was given, completing the service entrusted to him, even when the personal cost became immense.
A life risked for the work of Christ. A legacy not of fame, but of quiet, profound devotion.